First biography on country music superstar Keith Urban is going to be released to the public all over the world September the 26th. With me on Country Music News International is the author of that book, and that is Jeff Apter. Jeff, it is great to talk with you.
Absolutely. The same with me too, Al. It's good to speak to you across the thousands of miles that separate us.
Yeah, you're down under. I didn't know if you had done any hunting with Crocodile Dundee or not, but I'm glad that you're next to your computer so we can talk.
Yeah, we all do down here. Yeah, yeah. And I'm actually, if my pet kangaroo hops into the shot, it's okay. It's okay. She's tame.
Do you really have a pet kangaroo?
No, they're dangerous. Don't go near those beasts. I swear, man. Those hind feet, they'll kick you miles and miles.
One of the truck drivers out there, his name is Daz, that runs the bush country. He told me those kangaroos are worse trying to hit you than they are anything else, trying to get around the roads. Pretty interesting conversations.
Yeah, you hit one with your car, and your car will come off worse than the kangaroo. Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they're beasts.
Hope we get to come to Australia sometime. Your website, jeffapter.com.au. The new book coming out, Keith Urban's biography. It's the first biography. But first, I want to talk to you about your experiences because people need to know this ain't the first rodeo or book that you ever wrote. So tell us some of the things that you've done besides work for Rolling Stone magazine for many years.
Yeah, I guess I've written about 30 books now. I've been writing about music since, wow, the late 80s for a variety of magazines. I spent some time living in the States in the 90s. I lived just outside of New York. And that was a big thing for me because I got to meet and interview people like Aretha Franklin and the late Robbie Robertson. And I spent some time back here with Helen Reddy, some big stars. But I got to be honest, Keith Urban's career is one of the most interesting that I've charted. You know, it started in Nashville, in fact, 1998. I was living in the States. I was at Fanfare, and he wasn't playing. He was backstage, and there was a contingent of Australian performers, and Keith was just catching up with some people because he'd been in the States for about 5 years by that point. And a friend of mine who was a manager, he said, "Oh, Keith's over there. He's done it tough." And I was a journalist. Come on, Al. Immediately I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Tell me more. Tell me more. And I started to chart his career from there. And I wrote a fair bit about him when I was at Rolling Stone and saw a lot of great shows that he played just before he started to break internationally, just before his career really went supernova in America. He'd come back to Australia and played little shows, little club shows with the pickup band. And some of the best shows I've ever seen. Just fantastic. And I could just sense, you just had this sense that this guy's career was about to explode. And, here it is 20 odd years later, and he's king of the hill, top of the heap, right?
Wow. Yeah, he is. What a superstar. So it's taken you actually years to compile all the information and put this together.
Yeah, I guess it charts as sort of 25 years of Keith watching and listening and speaking with him a few times. So it's a long story for me as well. But I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, I think, to start the journey. And I've seen his career. And what's really interesting, as I was saying to you off mic, is in Australia, people aren't really aware of how big a star Keith is in America. And I think in America, people aren't aware of what Keith went through to get to where he is when he was learning his trade in Australia. So it's an interesting balance.
Well, I was going to save this for the end of the conversation, but I guess I'll tell it now as we get a little bit more into this book. But when I got to reading on this, I got to thinking immediately, you made this book so detailed. This would be a perfect book for a guide if somebody had dreams of going to Nashville because it shows the mistakes and it shows the triumphs. So this is a great guide for anybody that want to take it home with them and read it.
Yeah, it's sort of a how to and how to not guide, I guess. Yeah, Keith, I mean, by his own admission, he made some mistakes. He had a sort of failed start as part of a band called The Ranch, who was signed to Warner's, and they were going to be the country rock version of the Police. It was all going to happen for them. It all fell apart. They made a record for Warner's that was, I guess, too much record company involvement is probably the best way to describe it. And Keith ended up in rehab. It wasn't good. He was having some tough times, but he eventually got through that, and I think maybe that downward spiral was an essential part of his journey. It really toughened him up, and he learned from his mistakes, and he was never going to give up. That's the other thing about him. There was no way he was going to come back to Australia with his tail between his legs, because he saw Nash succeeding in America, and particularly in Nashville. He saw that as his destiny. It wasn't a challenge. He said at the time he saw Johnny Cash when Keith was only 3 years old play this show, he said, "That's it. That's what I want to do. That's where I'm destined to go." And as history's proved, he was right.
Well, I think the cover on the book explains a lot about Keith, just the way he's looking at the guitar on the book. And I would bring this book up, but I'm afraid, well, maybe people can see some of it. But him looking at that guitar, you could tell he's in the zone. There's no.
Oh, he's all about the music. He's all about the music. Yeah, absolutely. And that was the really refreshing thing. Like I said, when I saw him play quite a few small shows in and around in Sydney in particular, you could tell he was much more than a personality. He was a musician. And a lot of musicians, both here and particularly in and around Music City, really respect his talents. He plays with people who don't do it for laughs. There's some serious people who are really big fans. I mean, Ricky Skaggs gave the book, the thumbs up, and he's someone who's really been an advocate for Keith's musical talents, for years and years and years. So yeah, he's a player. He's absolutely a player.
Well, everything in the book, about a 300-page book, and you've got all of his awards at the end of the book, and all the interviews and how the information. And of course, you mentioned Country Music Hall of Famer Ricky Skaggs. You got Boz Skaggs that made comments. Let me thank Ann Pryor for getting us together. Kensington Books. I think she's the publisher, or no, I'm sorry, not the publisher, out of New York.
Yeah.
I want to thank Ann so much for that. Well, let me ask this. Keith was just a normal kid back in Australia. He didn't have a silver spoon. He had normal parents. Was it hard for him to open up and give the okay for this book to be written? And when you talked with him, was it hard for him to talk to you?
Yeah, well, I didn't speak to him specifically while I was writing this book. A lot of this is drawn on all these interviews and experiences I've had over the course of about 25 years. I'd be excited for him to write his own book. I think there'd be even more, and it would be a much more personal story, I guess. But look, a lot of people are really happy to talk about him because they're so proud of his achievements. A lot of the people that I spoke to for this book are just really thrilled to see how this guy, knowing what he's been through and knowing some of the downside of his journey, to see him not just succeed, but to stay at the top. I mean, come on, Al, you know that better than me. That's really hard to do. But he's adjusted. He's managed to, not conform, but to fit in his own way to what works in Nashville. And he's so hugely respected there. So yeah, a lot of people just enjoy, I think, the fact that they played a small part in, this great career.
What is the highlight? What is one of the highlights in this book that's your favorite?
I'm going to be a real fanboy here. And this is actually, it's going to come across as pretty dumb, but there was I think a week of Rolling Stones tributes on the Jimmy Fallon show. And Keith played Tumbling Dice. And his band included people like Chuck Leavett, who'd played with the Stones, these great people. And it's just one of the best, because, TV shows are hit and miss. You're in a studio, it's a bit cold, it's a bit sterile. He kills it. He absolutely nails it. And it's one of the best live TV performances I've ever seen. I'm sure I refer to it in the book. But, every time he steps on the stage, something magical happens. But that's a real standout for me. He did a great CMT Crossroads with John Mayer, which I love watching. I've watched that repeatedly because they're coming from different musical territories.
Right.
But they find this common ground, as guitar slingers. And it's some of the playing in that is just spectacular. It's really great.
I think another part of this book that I realized is, how people are. Jeff, they go crazy when they see somebody like Keith Urban on stage. They lose sight of he's just a person. I think when people get a chance to get a hold of this book, like me, they're going to have to read it more than once because I couldn't get through it, as I told you off air. I had to go back and relive some of those great details put in this book that I think it's going to bring them to know him more as a regular guy. And
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. I hope it also brings them back to his music as well. So, you know,
yeah,
it's one of those sort of reading experiences where you've got one finger on the button of your playlist and the other holding the book. So there's a great soundtrack just waiting to be heard while we're reading the book. Yeah, for sure.
well, one thing that I'll mention that is dear to me is when he went to work for a radio station and the mistakes that he made in the studio.
Yeah, that was the end of his broadcasting career. Yeah, he was just a kid. If I remember rightly, he was, maybe 11 or 12, and he just got some like a what we call work experience here. And he was supposed to be, from memory, supposed to be helping with the news, but in the end, he was cutting his own, soundtrack stuff and was interjecting into the news while it was being broadcast. So yeah, I think it was that moment he realized broadcasting's not I'm going to be on the other side of the mic. That's where I belong.
I love that because that's happened to a lot of different people. Keith Urban, that's really interesting. Another part of this book, and I'm just going to mention a couple things here, and I'm going to let you, if you want to tell a little bit more about it, because I don't want to reveal a whole lot, but I find it interesting that Garth Brooks, the chapter with Garth Brooks in here, and what Garth did at Fanfare that you documented. So if you want to continue on a little bit with that, you're more than welcome to. But I think it's amazing what Garth Brooks did, and of course what he called Keith Urban as well. So
yeah, there's two parts to that story. When Garth Brooks did his Life of Chris Gaines side project, a lot of people said, "Hang on, this is the character he was playing was an Australian musician from Brisbane. That's Keith." People are going, "It's Keith Urban." And it got very confusing, and in the end, Keith's saying it's not me, but people are saying, "Gee, I don't know, it seems very, very familiar," and Keith was misquoted, and in the end, Garth called him, and they had to sort of reconcile that, in no way was Keith saying that he was being copied or anything like that. But the event you refer to, yeah, I mean, it's funny because I first encountered Keith at Fanfare, and I've been to lots of festivals and concerts and things, but I've not seen anything like Fanfare. This is when it used to be held at the Nashville Speedway. Mm-hmm. So I think now there's a dedicated venue in town, but this was a little bit out of town, and they had the big sheds out the back, which I assume were used for, I don't know, chickens, livestock,
probably
something.
So.
And Garth Brooks spent 24 hours sitting there signing everything, books, records, arms, who knows, kneecaps, anything that was put in front of him, he signed and did not leave until the last person had his autograph. And I thought, that's dedication to your fans. That's the kind of commitment that, I think you only see in country music. Rock and rollers, they might give you a wave out of the limousine as they drive past, but country people said, typically, and Keith being a good example of this, is someone who definitely gives his fans as much of his time as possible. A good example of that is during lockdown. Keith and Nicole Kidman spent much of it here in Australia. In fact, about an hour from where I live, they've got a property there. And he was doing lots of live, streams and things from there. And it was great. It was a really good way of, connecting with his fans and saying, hey, I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. And he hosted, when he came back to the States, he hosted a show at a drive-in at Nashville for staff of the I think it's the Vanderbilt University Hospital, who'd been frontline workers during the pandemic. And it was the first artist to do this, so you could go in your car. It was locked. It was conforming to the lockdown rules. You weren't breaking any rules. But you stayed in your car, and instead of clapping, you beeped your horn at the end of a song. And it was just genius. And before you knew it, dozens of artists were doing the same thing. So he really blazed a trail there. It was a really effective way of keeping in touch with his fans, but also thanking those who'd been on the front line during the pandemic. So it was pretty impressive. Pretty impressive.
The book is called Keith Urban. It is written, the author, Jeff Apter, the first biography of Keith Urban. It's going to be released September the 26th to the world. And you can always go to jeffapter.com.au. There's just maybe one or two more things I want to ask you as far as
Sure.
time wise we've got. And I found that you never know about the conditions of two superstars getting together. And I found it interesting how Keith ended up meeting Nicole Kidman and the reason why they got together. I mean, I find that, I don't know, it just surprised me because they're superstars, but they're
Oh yeah,
regular
but they
people just
come
like,
from they come
yeah,
from vastly different backgrounds. That's the interesting thing. It was an event called G'day LA. It's an annual event that's hosted. It's really just it's a bit of it's a chance for expat Aussies who are doing well in the States to get together and pat each other on the back. That's basically what it is. And it was 2005. Keith wasn't supposed to be on it. Every year there's three people who are given particular acknowledgement of their achievements. And from memory, that year it was Hugh Jackman, Nicole Kidman, and Keith Urban. That's right. And you got to understand, Nicole Kidman comes from a very uptown Sydney family. Her father was a surgeon, very sophisticated people, private school education, money comes from
yeah,
money.
yeah,
Keith's dad used to run the garbage tip up in a place called Caboolture in Queensland. He was a very regular guy, a very working class family. And, Keith has always been quite proud of that. But at the same time, when you meet someone as polished and sophisticated and a Hollywood superstar like Nicole Kidman, he was a little bit apprehensive. It's like, whoa, she's out of my league, man. She comes from a different place altogether. But she'd come out of that complicated relationship with Tom Cruise. And I think a big part, I mean, sure, Keith's a handsome rooster. There's no doubt about that,
yeah.
but part of his appeal was that he was a regular guy, a well-grounded, a guy from a good working class background who really had a good grasp of the realities of the world, I guess, and was very, like I said, very grounded. And that was a big appeal. And when they got together, which was a fairly swift process, it took a few months, but,
Yeah.
a couple of rides on Keith's Harley, and before you know it, there were a couple. I think they really just found this amazing common ground. There's something about Australians overseas too. They have all these common experiences. Nicole's in Hollywood, Keith's in Nashville, but they shared experiences because they both were very ambitious and they both got to the top of their particular field. So they had that in common. But people were really surprised because, let's face it, country music doesn't have a great tradition of love matches. I'm thinking Lyle Lovett, Julia Roberts, Kenny Chesney and Renee Zellweger. These things didn't last too long, Al, but here it is almost 20 years later, and they're still very much a couple, kids, good, solid. They've got homes in Sydney and in Nashville and down here in the what we call the Highlands here in New South Wales. And they seem very comfortable with the public. It's a really strong relationship, and it's still going strong now. In fact, during those lockdown sessions, Nicole made a few cameo appearances while Keith was playing, and it was great. It was really friendly and warm and very engaging, and you really got the sense that this is a love match. This is Johnny Cash and June Carter. That's what this is. Possibly without the pills. Yeah, I think without the pills. But you know what I'm saying? They're a very connected couple, and they will be. I see no reason to think that it's not going to be the case for the rest of their lives.
Well, one thing about it, when people are able to get this book on September the 26th, they're going to be able to read all about not only the things that we talked about, but some of the things that we haven't mentioned. And I think maybe it'd be better to keep the rest of that secret. But once again, I'm just going to say is it's a guide for anybody who wants to try to make it in Nashville. It's a great guide. It's a very detailed book. And it's unfortunate. I'm going to have to go back through and reread and absorb those details that you put in about Keith Urban, Jeff. And that's all I can say about it. It's fantastic. And if there's anything else you'd like to add as we finish up, I'd love to have you talk about it more.
I don't want to give too much away, Al. I want people to read the book. But all I'm saying is, Hollywood producers, there's a great film to be made about this guy's life. You know, it's
Yes.
a really it's a three actor. You know, there's three acts of his life. There's Australia, there's the struggle, and then the success. And I think it's, yeah, you're right. I think it's sort of a cautionary tale, but at the same time, it's a cautionary tale with, frankly, a happy ending. With he really did achieve this. And you have to understand too. A lot of people in Australia were like, "Come on, man, Nashville, you're never going to make it. That's like selling ice to, the Eskimos. It's impossible. How are you going to sell country music back to Americans?" But he's managed to achieve that. I think a big part of that, I mentioned his father before. He was a big player in Keith's story because he was a big American country music fan. We have our own version of country music here, but it tends to be, it's what we call bush ballads. It's songs about, far-flung rural places with names like Broken Hill and Gundawindi, and
Right.
it's a very different style of music. But Keith's dad introduced him to Glenn Campbell, Charlie
Yeah.
Pride, Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, the classics. And that's the well that Keith drew upon for his musical experiences. So in a lot of ways, it made sense that he pursued an American dream, not an Australian one. But now when he comes back and plays in Australia, he's playing stadiums. He's playing the big rooms. So it's working for him all around the world.
Everybody get the book. His mom and dad, regular people. I'm not going to tell you anything about what they did and how they did it, but you'll just have to read that stuff and all the other highlights in the book. Jeff Apter, it has just been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. The Keith Urban book coming out September the 26th around the world. You can pick it up on any platform. I assume it's going to be in bookstores. And I've got the paperback version that Ann sent me, but you also got a book that's coming out in hardcover as well, correct?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, there'll be a hardcover to start with. Yep. Good bookstores, in between bookstores, bad bookstores, you name it. It'll be there. It'll be there. All
And your
platforms.
website.
Yes. Yeah. But it's much easier just to get it from platforms and different places you can get in the States. So, yeah, I'm really excited to see how the American audience responds to the book. So it's exciting for me. Yeah.
I'm excited to see myself. Jeff, thank you so much for being on Country Music News International, and I hope you and I get to speak again.
Look, next time, let's hope we're in the same zip code. Yeah.
Well, let's try. Why don't you come to Virginia? Because I live in Virginia. I can take you around and show you bears and lions and tigers, and no kangaroos though.
No, well, I'll return the favor when you come to Australia. I'll give you the marsupial tour. Yeah.
I'd love to.
Yeah,
Jeff,
watch out for those koalas.
now you're talking about stuff that I'm going to have to go study on, Jeff. I've never been to Australia, but if I ever get a chance to come, you'll be the first person to know.
You got it.
All right. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot. It was great to talk to you, Al.
You too.